This is my first evening filming session in quite a while, so if I look and sound like I'm tired, I am. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane and I like to paint crap on my face. We are back with another installment, a little makeup series that I have where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths. Each episode I attempt to bring these stories to life through a makeup look inspired by the creatures behind the legends. If you like makeup and you're interested in info dumps on mythological creatures, by all means I would suggest hitting subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, why not leave a like? And oh my god, today is a fascinating one because it went in such a different direction than I thought it would, because we're going to be looking into the mythology, history and origins of the Jinn, who eventually later become known as Genies. I think this is probably going to end up being quite a long one and it has the potential to get very confusing. So grab a Red Bull, grab a monster, grab a water, grab a seat, and let's get started. So the girls who regularly do the whole like slicked back bun hair thing, how? I've already given myself a headache and it's like super messy. I very much have a newfound respect for the people who do this kind of thing on a regular basis. Anyway, for those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will leave links to all the products that I use in the description box down below. I have some new coloured setting powders to use today, which I'm very excited about. As always as well, I will apologise in advance for any and all errors in pronunciation of names, places, just words in general. A lot of this research takes me to various different countries and stories from different places, and some of the words are incredibly hard to pronounce. I do try my best with them, but if there are any that I mess up, again, I do apologise. Please feel free to correct me in the comments if I do get them wrong. So, last week we looked at the succubus and a few of her variants from other countries and cultures, one of which was the Qareen from Arabian mythology. Now, I had a comment from a user whose username I'm not going to try and pronounce because I will probably get it wrong, so here, who explained that there was also something called the Qareen in Arabian mythology that was basically considered like the other you, like a double of yourself, but in like Jinn or demon form. They also added the side note that if you were to suffer any kind of like violent or horrific death, this other Jinn, this Qareen, would basically seek out revenge on your behalf to the person or place where it happened, and they would like haunt that person or that place. I don't know why, but in my head it made me think of like the shadow in Peter Pan, how it's like attached to him, but it's its own separate like entity. I found it particularly interesting, so naturally I fell down a huge rabbit hole of looking into Jinn mythology, and as I said at the beginning, I knew Jinn were like the origins of Genies, like the modern day Genies that we think of, but as it turns out, not quite in the way that I expected. So beyond the modern day Genie, the Jinn can be traced back to the Middle East, specifically in pre-Islamic and Islamic mythology. Now, Genies as we tend to think of them today often have two sort of main variations. You have the Aladdin style genie trapped in some kind of jar or vessel who is generally fairly benevolent and grants 3 wishes, that kind of thing. Then you have the slightly darker version who still grants wishes, but in what I would say is probably more of a malicious compliance kind of way. Like they take the wish that they're given overly literally. I think the most famous example is usually someone wishing for money or riches, and then the next day a member of their family dies and they inherit the money. However, the origins of the Jinn are remarkably different from this whole idea of a genie. So the word Jinn is an Arabic collective noun which stems from the root word jan, which generally means like to hide or adapt. The word itself has been interpreted by some people as literally meaning beings that are concealed from sight or hidden from sight. Now, as with a majority of mythical words and terms, the exact origins of the word are unknown. Some people believe it relates to the Latin word genius, which was a guardian spirit of people and places in Roman religion, and that it came about as a result of the assimilation between religions during the Roman Empire. The Aramaic Genea, again meaning guardian or like protective deity, is also suggested to be another possible origin for the term Jinn. as they often serve quite similar functions, and you know, Jinn, Jinnah. Some believe the term has Persian origins through the form of the Jaina, which was a wicked female spirit from, please bear with me, possibly pre-Zoroastrianism mythology, Zoroastrianism being the oldest religion that is still practiced in Iran, which emerged around like the 2nd millennium BC or BCE. The word jinn has also evolved through various translations over time. So the original Arabic word is J-I-N-N. This was later Romanized as Jinn, but with a silent D in front of it. And then the anglicised word genie first appeared in the 18th century translation of 1001 Nights, which was a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales compiled in the Arabic language during the Islamic Golden Age. I really hope you're following along with me because I got so confused doing all of this and I'm trying really hard to keep it like coherent. Also, this is giving all kinds of Smurf right now. Now, this collection of tales, 1001 Nights, is most commonly referred to in English as Arabian Nights, and one of the tales that is included in it is the tale of Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. So basically, 1001 Nights was compiled during the Islamic Golden Age, which was between like the 8th and 13th century. But then between 1706 and 1721, French and English language editions were published, where it became referred to as Arabian Nights, and the use of the word genie first appears, and the anglicised genie comes from the French genie, which in turn also comes from the Latin word genius. I don't know if the Latin word is meant to be pronounced differently to how we say genius, because obviously it has somewhat significantly different meaning, but we'll get back to that translation and the evolution into the word genie in a minute. Because first of all, who or what exactly were the original jinn? So the jinn are supernatural spirits who are often compared to the more westernized idea of like an angel, or in some cases a demon, but kind of along that level of like spirit. And jinn have the ability to shapeshift, and they can take the form of a human or an animal if they choose to, but generally speaking, they are invisible to humans. They are able to interact with humans, and they have free will, just like we do, so they can do like both good and evil deeds. Though generally they don't tend to interfere with humans, preferring to sort of live in their own tribes and societies quite far away from human settlements. The exact origins of this belief are, again, unclear, but namely because it's actually such an old belief that it's really hard to trace it back to sort of where it started. So as well as being testified within the Quran, belief in the jinn has also been testified in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, which dates back roughly between like 540 and 620 AD. Oh, okay, that was a bit brighter than I meant it to be. So within pre-Islamic Arabia, there were many Arabs who worshipped the jinn, and it's believed that they would like inhabit or haunt desolate, dark, dingy places in the desert, and they were generally associated with areas that were like unclean and just a bit grim. So things like caves, old abandoned ruins, that was their haunt, that was where they were. So because of this association with places that were unclean or abandoned, as is the case with quite a lot of spirits within mythology, especially ones that are supposedly malevolent in any way, the jinn were often blamed for and like held responsible for misfortunes that occurred, but specifically in the form of like diseases or any kind of mental illness. Now, despite their associations with like diseases and malevolent behaviour, the word jinn was often used quite interchangeably with the word ilah, meaning deity, and there were at least some friendly or helpful beings among the jinn. And generally speaking, any distinction between a jinn and a god wasn't based on their like morality, i.e. a god was good and a jinn was evil. It was based on how they were worshipped, because in pre-Islamic Arabia, gods were worshipped publicly, whereas the jinn were worshipped in private. There was an Arab author called Al-Jahiz who was known for this like insanely huge library of works that spanned a crazy number of different like study areas around sort of 800 AD. And I mean, his catalogue of work spans like zoology, philosophy, grammar, theology, literature, linguistics. Like, the guy was hitting like every category. But basically, he attested to and believed that pre-Islamic Arabs would have believed that the jinn lived in like societies of their own that consisted of like several different tribes and groups who all came together, and like as far as humans went, they were able to protect them or marry them, kidnap them, possess them, or in some cases even kill humans. Even though the jinn are generally considered to be invisible, in pre-Islamic beliefs, they are considered to have a body. But obviously beyond that, they are known for being shapeshifters, both into human form and animal, though generally they tend to prefer taking on animal forms. Specifically, that of a snake is their like overall preferred one. But also things like scorpions, lizards, other serpents. But it's believed that when they do shift into like human form, they're not completely human. There's still some part of them that retains like an animal feature. There are some sources as well that state it was believed that if a jinn was ever killed, it would leave behind a carcass that was kind of similar to that of a scorpion or a serpent. Now, despite the fact that the jinn were usually worshipped alongside gods, and generally speaking their powers would significantly outweigh that of a human, it was plausible that a human would be able to kill a single Genie in sort of one-to-one single combat. However, due to the fact that the jinn are invisible, they have a significant advantage of being able to attack without being seen, and it's in turn something that they actually became quite feared for, which I mean makes sense. Now, on the flip side of being feared for and on rare occasions attacking humans, the jinn also like inspired awe, basically, and they were known to befriend humans on occasion or even have like romantic feelings and attachments to them. Again, going back to what Al-Jahiz said about them even being able to marry humans. It's apparently quite a common Arabian belief that pre-Islamic philosophers and poets, as well as like soothsayers, were all inspired by jinn. There are quite a number of well-known Arabian poets from like the 6th and 7th century who claimed that they received their inspiration from the jinn, often referring to them as their like Genie brother or their Genie friend. Now, whilst the relationship between the jinn and the sort of poets and philosophers that they inspired was very much a sort of mutual relationship, the connection and relationship between a jinn and a soothsayer was remarkably different. So soothsayer is just basically another word for essentially like a fortune teller. They're sometimes called mediums or fortune tellers, basically anyone who utilizes a kind of supernatural element or claims to have a sixth sense that they can communicate with spirits and ghosts, that kind of thing. So it's believed that soothsayers were not inspired by the jinn, but were instead essentially like possessed by them, because the particular Genie would enter their body and basically gain complete control over them. The reason the soothsayer was then contacted for advice about the future, fortunes, or revealing like hidden information is because it was believed that the Genie that was speaking through them had the ability to reveal this like hidden knowledge, and the soothsayer essentially just became like a conduit or like a vessel for them to speak through. I always forget how pigmented this blue is. This is very intense right now. So moving on from pre-Islamic Arabia, as well as being attested to in multiple texts that predate Islam, the jinn are mentioned like somewhere between 29 and 33 times in the Quran, especially in the earlier chapters. I think this is the brightest setting powder I have ever used in my life. One example is that the Quran states that Muhammad was sent as a prophet to both the human and jinn communities, and it often depicts humans and jinn as like a pair, basically being equal in status regardless of their creation, and it rejects this pre-Islamic idea that the jinn share any kind of like divinity with deities or the creator. It goes on to explain that where humans are made of dirt and clay, i.e. the earth, the Jinn were made from smokeless fire, but both were made to worship God, but of their own free will, which allows human and Jinn alike to perform good or evil deeds. The Jinn are believed to be rational creatures, and they're not like inherently good or evil, but just as humans are, they are subject to the judgment and punishment of God. The 72nd chapter of the Quran is called Al-Jinn, and it is specifically about the Jinn, and it mentions righteous Jinn on one hand and malicious Jinn on the other. Despite this reference to malicious Jinn, it also states that the Jinn can neither harm nor benefit humans because they're basically preoccupied with looking after themselves and their own communities and societies and their own place within the cosmos. Which, despite a lot of the comparisons that are drawn between them, it is a huge difference to the demons and devils that are present in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So whilst the Quran doesn't condemn the Jinn as being a source of harm towards humans, it does condemn them, and technically humans along with them, for basically ascribing these divine attributes and mistaking the Jinn as creatures being worthy of worship, because obviously in pre-Islamic Arabia they were worshipped alongside the gods. So the Quran essentially condemns the pre-Islamic belief that the Jinn were deities of some sort, and in turn the humans who then worshipped them. The Quran actually interprets the word Jinn in two different ways, one of which is using it to describe any object that can't be detected by human sensory organs, i.e. the five senses, which includes things like angels and devils and the souls of other human beings. Hence why the whole sixth sense thing is the people who can see those things. The other interpretation is that the Jinn are a specific invisible being considered to be accountable for their own deeds alongside humans, created out of fire and air, and the offspring of something known as the Jann, who were said to have inhabited the earth before Adam, as in Adam and Eve. So Jann is the root word for the word Jinn, meaning to hide or to conceal, but it can also be used to refer to an agile snake. So the term Jann is used to describe both a supernatural creature and a snake. There was one account that I found of the word Jann that stated, creatures called Jann lived on earth, but they caused mischief in it and shed blood. So God sent his angels who drove them away from the earth, and it is said that these angels became the inhabitants of the earth after the Jann. And a slight side note on that, just because obviously where it has mentioned Adam, I find it quite interesting some of the parallels that appear in quite a few different mythologies about the snake or the serpentine figure and the concept of sinning or disobeying, because again you've got this kind of creature who has associations with snakes, likes turning into them. The word can also mean snake, and then this story about them sinning and not necessarily rebelling, but going against the word of God and then being punished for it. Within the Quran, there is some reference to angels who were complaining, basically, about the creation of Adam, and it was then linked to them slowly witnessing the corruption of the offspring of the Jann, who had been the rulers of the world before Adam came along, essentially kind of tying in the corruption of the Jann to the creation of Adam. There was an Islamic scholar from the late 10th century who basically explained that after God had created the world, he created the Jann from smokeless fire and entrusted them to govern the earth. But corruption began to spread amongst their descendants, the Jinn, after which God sent the angels from heaven down, led by the angel Azazil, in order to defeat the Jinn and drive them away. Slight side note on that actually, because where Azazil is a figure from Islamic tradition, he is believed to be the original name of Satan, and according to various Islamic beliefs, he was originally the master of the angels, being both the strongest, the most powerful, and the most knowledgeable of all of them, hence why he was leading them to defeat the Jinn. However, after he defeated the Jinn and successfully drove them away, he became very, very arrogant about it. And basically, when God created a successor to the Jinn, i.e. Adam, he commanded the angels to bow down to his creation, but Azazil refused to do so, basically believing that he was better than that, which ultimately was his downfall, and God condemned him to hell. Between my research last time on the succubus and like Samael and the relationship with Adam and the devil and everything, it's so fascinating to see different cultures' interpretations or links, crossovers kind of thing between the whole idea of like God and the devil. So because of their mentions within the Quran, the Jinn were adopted into Islamic culture in what is known as greater tradition, or like official Islam. But some depictions are also categorized into what is known as little tradition, which is essentially folklore. So Islam allowed the integration of a lot of local beliefs about spirits and deities from places like Iran, Africa, Turkey, and India without demonizing them, because the Quran does not like automatically consider foreign mythological beings to be devils. Instead, they were seen as like entities who had been mistakenly assigned like divine power. As such, this led to the Jinn often being seen as like either neutral or sort of morally ambiguous and not directly related to devils, but instead they existed alongside other supernatural creatures like devils, but also things like fairies. Okay, now comes the time where I need to do some slightly precise line work for a second, so be right back. I forgot how much it like tickles when you have to paint around your nose, and I feel like I desperately need to sneeze. So where they can be considered to commit both good and evil deeds, the moral compass of the Jinn was usually associated with their religion and beliefs. So good Jinn were usually considered Muslim Jinn or Jinn Islam, whereas unbelieving Jinns were the ones who were tempted by the devils. But it wasn't just Islam that the Jinns could practice. They were also believed to practice Christianity and Judaism, and then these like good Jinn were considered to be a lot more malevolent, often teaching people like moral lessons, offering aid to spiritual people like shamans in Central Asia, spiritual healers in Senegal, and obviously things like soothsayers and that sort of thing. So similar to the greater tradition or official Islam, the folklore of the Jinn reiterates the belief that, generally speaking, they don't tend to get involved or interfere with human affairs, generally preferring to live in their own little societies in desolate or abandoned places. And generally speaking, they would only ever get involved with humans in a negative way if they were sort of angered or disturbed. The examples that I found were like if their children were stepped on or trodden on, or if like hot water was thrown on them, following which they would then seek out revenge against whichever human it was who had done it. Because of this fear of like angering or disturbing the Jinn, Muslims would often state destur, or permission basically, before doing something that could accidentally harm the Jinn, such as sprinkling hot water on public grounds or plants, in which case it would signal to any Jinn that were nearby that they could leave, because again, the Jinn are invisible, so humans wouldn't know if they were there or not. So generally speaking, any kind of incident towards the Jinn would be an accident, because they wouldn't know the children were there to get stepped on or before they sprinkled the water. So it became a bit of a custom to verbalise permission before what they were about to do as sort of a warning to them. Jinn that are angered to the point of taking their revenge on humans, or in the cases of Jinn who are just a bit straight up evil, they're able to cause harm to humans by way of both physical damage as well as causing like illnesses. And in some cases, they're able to take control of the human's body and possess them. However, the latter is only under certain circumstances. So it's believed that the Jinn can only inhabit and take possession of a human body if the human is in a state of mental weakness. There is an Arabic phrase for this, which I'm not going to try and pronounce because I will definitely get it wrong. So feelings of insecurity, being in unhappy relationships or experiencing unhappy love, mental instability and things like depression, which was also known as tired from the soul, which was an incredibly poetic way of putting it. They were all considered forms of mental weakness, therefore making someone more susceptible to jinn possession. Oftentimes for those who were possessed, it was believed that an exorcism was required in order to rid the body of the jinn, and in order to try and protect themselves against these kind of jinn attacks, many Muslims would wear like an amulet engraved with the name of God. I did also find one reference to jinn apparently being afraid of wolves and iron, but beyond that I couldn't really find any other information as to why that was. There are some teachings in modern Islam that discourage the belief of the jinn. However, the cultural belief is still quite popular amongst like Muslim societies, and the belief that the jinn are like sapient creatures who live alongside humans is still quite widespread in sort of Middle Eastern countries, including Egypt and West Africa. Similarly, in a lot of places where the belief in the jinn is still quite popular, mental illnesses are often still attributed to jinn possession. Now, despite the belief in the jinn still remaining quite popular, in more modern times, the jinn were actually portrayed in much more of a negative light, rather than this kind of like morally ambiguous grey zone. And there are certain movements that, whilst they don't dispute the existence of the jinn, they instead basically depict them as malevolent beings who should be avoided and feared. And in a lot of more modern tales, the word jinn is used for div or demon, gradually causing a bit of a shift in the meaning. There was actually a study done in like 2012 that published data on the percentage of Muslims in different countries who confirmed some level of belief in the existence of the jinn, with Morocco being at the top with 88% of Muslims believing that they exist in one form or another. Bangladesh was 84%, Pakistan was 77%, Afghanistan was 70%, etc, etc. Like, the figures for that are really quite high, which I found quite surprising. Obviously, that study is now over a decade old, so it would be very interesting to see what those figures are like today. But further to this, during a Cambridge neuroscience study, it was found that in Egypt in particular, it was believed that sleep paralysis was caused by the jinn and was referred to as a jinn attack. Now, this study found that as many as 48% of people who suffered from sleep paralysis believed that they had been assaulted by the jinn, and 95% of those sufferers would recite verses from the Quran during this attack in order to try and prevent future attacks from the jinn. And then a further 9% of those people would increase their daily Islamic prayers in order to try and get rid of these ongoing attacks. So from pre-Islamic jinn being worshipped alongside gods, to more modern Islamic interpretations of them being free-willed, sapient creatures who live alongside humans, how exactly did the evolution of the jinn lead to a film with Will Smith being painted blue? I would insert a picture of it for like humour's sake, but I don't want to get sued. So to follow this strange little evolutionary journey, we have to go back to the collection of folk tales, 1001 Nights, or Arabian Nights, particularly the story of Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. The whole collection was compiled over centuries by various different authors and translators and scholars, with some of the tales tracing their roots back to ancient and medieval Arabic, Persian and Mesopotamian literature. But most of the tales do actually have origins just as folk stories from the Abbasid and Mamluk eras, which were two empires from like the 13th to the 16th centuries. The way this collection is compiled is that all of these folk tales and stories that have been collected over the years are being told by someone called Scheherazade as she narrates them to her husband, the ruler Sharia, the idea being that one tale is told for every night of storytelling, hence 1001 Nights. To that end, there are certain editions of 1001 Nights that actually contain 1001 stories, or in some cases even more than that. However, a lot of other editions only tend to contain like a couple of hundred stories. So I mentioned before the tale of Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp came from this collection of stories, which is technically true. However, it was never actually a part of the original Arabic versions. So you'll have to bear with me on this because I'm going to throw a lot of names and a few dates and it might get a bit confusing, but try and follow along because it is kind of crazy. So as part of the etymology from the word Jinn into Genie, I mentioned the French language translation of these tales, and it was actually this translation that added the story of Aladdin to this collection. It was composed by the French translator Antoine Galland, and he became incredibly famous for being the first European to translate these stories. So his version of this collection of stories spanned 12 volumes between 1704 and 1717, and it exerted a fairly substantial influence over a lot of later European literature and general attitude towards Islam and the Islamic community. Now, he'd already begun publishing some of his translations of these works when in 1709 he was introduced to someone named Anton Yusuf Hanna Diab, a Syrian Maronite writer and storyteller. I had to look it up as well. The Maronites are a Syriac Christian ethno-religious group native to the Eastern Mediterranean. It was actually Hanna Diab who is credited as basically originating the best well-known versions of the tale of Aladdin, as well as the tale of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And it was after he met Galland and relayed these tales to him that Galland then translated them and included them in the final volumes of his collection of 1001 Stories. Side note on this, because Galland never actually gave any credit to Hanna Diab as the author in his publications, the main reason we knew of their meeting in the first place was through a very, very brief mention in Galland's diary from the day that he met him. It wasn't until like 2015, following the translation and publication of Diab's Arabic manuscript autobiography, that we found out a little bit more information about Diab and his correlation to those stories. Because many scholars have argued that Diab should be understood as the original author of these stories, and that in several of them, including Aladdin, they appear to have been inspired by Diab's own life, because there's a lot of parallels between the story and the details included in his autobiography. According to Diab's autobiography, Galland was afraid that Diab would gain a position at like the Royal Library that he desperately wanted for himself, so he didn't credit him with the stories in order to try and keep all the credit for it, and Diab actually believed that Galland was conspiring to try and send him back to Aleppo, where he came from. So as well as trying to steal these stories and basically claim them as his own, Galland also made some alterations to his translations in order to try and fit in with the taste and literature of the time in Europe. One of which was the rising trend and popularity of fairy tales and fairy stories, which was in turn part of the reason why his translations became so successful. Now, the popularity of the sort of fairy story genre had been started in France in the 1690s by one of Galland's friends, a man named Charles Perrault, who is credited as basically laying the foundations for fairy tales as a new literary genre. So as well as retelling a lot of these Arabic folk tales to fit in with the French genre of fairy tales, Galland also removed a lot of the original passages that had a much more erotic theme, as well as all of the poetry, again in order to try and fit in with the sort of generalized rules of literature in Europe at the time. Now, as with most like Disney retellings of classic cultural folktales, the original story of Aladdin is quite different from the story that we tend to think of. It's known as one of the orphan tales from 1001 Nights, along with Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and it follows the tale of a young impoverished miscreant called Aladdin. Interestingly enough, even though it's an Arabic folktale, the original text actually puts the setting as being one of the ancient cities of China, but there's basically nothing else in the rest of the stories to like tie it to China, because everything else is consistent with a Middle Eastern setting, i.e. the ruler being referred to as a sultan rather than an emperor, and the people within the story are Muslim. Now, Muslims have been included as part of ethnic groups throughout Chinese history, and Islamic communities have been known to exist in that region since like the Tang dynasty. And there are some who have suggested that the intended setting for the story may have actually been what was known as Turkestan, a historical region in Central Asia located in the northwest of modern-day China. However, it was also noted that in like early Arabic use, China as like a place was kind of used as a bit of a catch-all term to basically describe any kind of exotic faraway land, which potentially makes sense if Galland was leaning more into like the fairy tale genre that was popular at the time, because think how many fairy tales are set in some unknown land far, far away. The general plot is that Aladdin is approached by a sorcerer who poses as his uncle, and the sorcerer leads Aladdin to believe that he can basically turn him into like a wealthy merchant. But his real motive is to convince Aladdin to retrieve this wonderful oil lamp from a trapped magic cave. So the sorcerer lends Aladdin this like magic ring and takes him to the cave, where he then double crosses him, or tries to double cross him, which leads to Aladdin becoming trapped in this cave. Now, the sorcerer seems to forget that he has given Aladdin this magic ring, and once he's in the cave, Aladdin starts like rubbing his hands together in despair, at which point he rubs against the ring and a genie comes out. The genie then helps Aladdin to escape from the cave, where he then returns to his mother with the lamp that the sorcerer had sent him to get in the first place. Now, when Aladdin's mother attempted to clean the lamp, because it was just this dirty, gross looking thing, a second genie popped out. Only this one was significantly more powerful than the one contained within the ring, and this particular genie, having been captured inside the lamp, was bound to do the bidding of whoever held it, which technically should have been Aladdin's mother if she was the one who cleaned it. Either way, Aladdin uses the lamp to gain riches and success and wealth and becomes incredibly powerful. Aladdin then uses the genie to secure a marriage to the Sultan's daughter, Princess, bear with me, Badraul Badur. I've really tried my hardest with that one. Now, bearing in mind, his securing this marriage only comes after he used the magic in the genie to disrupt a marriage that she was already meant to have, which, but along with his wealth and his success and his bride, all thanks to the genie, Aladdin then commands the genie to build him a huge palace, which he does, and apparently Aladdin's palace was far greater and more magnificent than the Sultan's own. I kind of want to add gold to the lid, but I don't know if it's going to ruin it. I might do it anyway. Now, unsurprisingly, the sorcerer hears all about Aladdin's success and his new life, and he approaches Aladdin's wife to offer an exchange of new lamps for old. Now, Aladdin's wife, not realizing the importance of this lamp, because I'm assuming Aladdin didn't tell her about the whole genie thing, she agrees to the exchange. Once he has the lamp, the sorcerer then commands the genie to move the palace and all of its contents to his own home. But once again, he forgets that Aladdin still possesses the magic ring that he gave him from the cave. Obviously, this ring contains the lesser genie that helped Aladdin escape in the first place. Aladdin then once again utilizes the lesser genie to follow the sorcerer back to his home, because whilst the genie could still perform magic, it wasn't powerful enough to like undo the magic of the lamp genie. I can't tell if the gold ruined it or not. Once he travels to the sorcerer's home, Aladdin then apparently uses the princess, his wife, to basically charm the sorcerer so that Aladdin can retrieve the lamp, which, again, something feels off about that. But either way, he uses his wife's womanly wiles to basically distract the sorcerer. He retrieves the lamp, and then he slays the sorcerer and orders the genie to return the palace and all of its contents to where it originally stood. Lovely happy ending for Aladdin. Now, other than the etymology of the words and the translation from Jinn into Genie, the story of Aladdin doesn't really seem to fit the narrative of the origins of the Jinn. There are some similarities, i.e. the genie living in a cave, so like a desolate or abandoned place, but the whole lamp and the wishes thing don't really seem to fit. Now, one thing I've seen quite a few references to during my research of not only this, but quite a few other topics as well, is something known as the Arn Thompson Uther Index, the ATU, which is basically a catalogue of different types of folktale used as part of like folklore study. Now, the ATU index is huge, and it's had numerous revisions and expansions since it was first published in Germany by the Finnish folklorist Antti Arn in 1910. I feel like I've pronounced that wrong. Now, within this index is over 2,500 different types of fairy tale, and it uses a number catalogue system to organise them, with each type being given a unique AT number, and then any subtype within that is then followed by a letter at the end. So for example, Cinderella is listed under the entry 510A, with 510 being the category of the persecuted heroine. Now within the ATU, the story of Aladdin is classified as tale type 561, and it's placed within the index next to two similar tales, 560, the magic ring, and 562, the spirit in the blue light, with all three stories being about a sort of down on his luck, impoverished boy who finds a magical item that grants him wishes. Now, whilst all three of these are very similar tales, to the extent that some people have argued it can be hard to distinguish between them, the ultimate source of the tale type, including a genie or spirit being trapped in a container, goes back to Greek mythology, because of course it does. Specifically, it's within Homer's Iliad, where the god Ares is trapped inside a bronze urn and offers to grant Hermes anything he wishes if he sets him free. Now, since the tale of Aladdin appeared in the Galan translation of 1001 Nights, it became quite integrated into oral tradition and storytelling, and scholars began finding a lot of variants across like Europe and the Middle East, with the greatest like distribution density being Europe and the Mediterranean region, which eventually led to the variant of the genie granting 3 wishes, specifically, which was then popularized in the West in like the 20th century, which is why we obviously have the common association now of a genie who grants 3 wishes. Despite Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp being the most well-known tale of like the genie in the lamp, or the Genie in the lamp, there is another tale from 1001 Nights that shares a lot of parallels to this concept type. I've seen the story referred to by 2 different names. So the initial research I found, it was called The Fisherman and the Genie, but then a little bit later on I found another variation where the details were slightly different, but the story was called The City of Brass. I don't know why there's these 2 different versions, but for this instance I'm talking about it from the perspective of the fisherman and the genie. Similar to Aladdin, the story centres around a poor, impoverished old fisherman who casts his net out 4 times a day, and only 4 times a day. Then one day, after he catches a dead donkey, a pitcher full of dirt, and a load of like shards of glass, just before his 4th attempt, he calls upon the name of God to try and help him, and then casts out his net. He then pulls up a copper jar with a cap, and on that cap is the seal of Solomon, after which the fisherman is very happy because he can sell the jar and make some money. But at this point, curiosity gets the better of him as to whether or not there's anything inside the jar that could potentially be more valuable, so he pops the seal off. Once he pops the seal off, there is a large plume of smoke that comes out of the jar, and it then condenses into the form of what is known as an Ifrit. Now, in some places, an Ifrit is listed as like a more powerful, malevolent type of Jinn, but for the most part, it seems to actually be a very powerful type of demon in Islamic culture. Now, because references to the Ifrit was usually followed by the phrase among the Jinn, the distinction between the two has sort of varied quite a lot, but generally speaking, the Ifrit were very much malicious and more closely akin to demons. So the Ifrit pops out of the jar thinking that Solomon has come to kill him. However, when the fisherman informs him that Solomon has been dead for like hundreds of years, the Ifrit is completely overjoyed, and he grants the fisherman not a wish, but a choice in how he dies. The Ifrit then goes on to explain that during his first century of imprisonment, he swore to provide riches and anything else to whoever freed him, but no one did. The 2nd century, he swore to provide great wealth to whoever freed him, but no one did. The 3rd century, he swore to grant the wishes of whoever freed him, but again, no one did. Then after 400 years of imprisonment, the Ifrit became enraged, and he swore instead to grant the person a choice in how they died. So naturally what follows is a lot of back and forth between the Fisherman and the Ifrit, generally with the Fisherman pleading for his life and the Ifrit saying no. So the Fisherman decides to try and trick the Ifrit by asking him how he managed to fit in the jar in the first place. Now, the Ifrit, who was incredibly eager to show off his powers and what he could do, shrunk himself down and went back inside the jar to prove how he could do it, at which point the Fisherman just puts the cap back on. The Fisherman threatens to throw the jar back into the sea, at which point the tables turn and the Ifrit is now left pleading with the Fisherman to let him out. The Fisherman then begins to tell Ifrit this cautionary folk tale about why the Ifrit should spare his life, basically along the lines of don't bite the hand that feeds, in the sense that the Fisherman is the one who saved him, so he shouldn't punish him for being saved. At which point the Ifrit does agree to help the Fisherman if he releases him. The rest of the story takes quite a big tangent away from the Ifrit and the wishes and that kind of thing, and it kind of generally focuses more on the Fisherman's life after this event. But despite this, the story is classified within the ATU index as tale type ATU 331, the spirit in the bottle, and according to scholars, similar stories have appeared in some literature from the Middle Ages, specifically around the 13th century, but others have argued that the literature actually derives from various legends about King Solomon in the first place. Obviously, I did briefly mention King Solomon in my last video about the succubus because he is another figure in mythology who seems to pop up quite a lot. There is actually a tale from the Brothers Grimm that is considered the same sort of story type as the Fisherman and the Genie, and it is actually called The Spirit in the Bottle. It follows the story of a woodcutter and his young son who always wanted to go to school, but they couldn't afford for him to go, so he returns home and tries to help his father in the woods. Whilst he's in the woods, he ends up hearing a voice stating that it's been trapped at the bottom of a tree. Now, when the boy goes to have a look, he finds a bottle, and he then opens it and a giant demon comes out who then immediately threatens to break his neck and just kill him. So the woodcutter's son uses the same bait to try and trick the demon by asking him how he fit into the bottle in the first place. And again, the demon got back into the bottle in order to show off his powers, at which point the boy put the lid back on. The demon pleaded for his freedom, and the boy said that he would only basically let him out if the demon could benefit him in some way, to which the demon agrees. And the boy decides that it's worth the risk, and so he lets the demon out. After this, the demon presented him with a piece of magical cloth. One side would turn any material into pure silver, and the other side could heal any wound. The boy then uses the cloth to turn the head of his axe into pure silver, and when he then goes to show his father and try and chop down a tree, surprisingly enough, the axe head bent because it's made of silver. Now, the father was not particularly happy about this because it was actually their neighbour's axe that he had borrowed, and obviously now they had to pay to replace it, which they couldn't really do. But when the boy went to sell the axe head, because it was made of pure silver, he made more than 400 times the amount that they needed to replace said axe. And it was at this point that he then told his father what happened with the bottle and the demon and the deal that he made. Now, the woodcutter is incredibly happy about this because he recognises basically his son's sort of cleverness in securing their riches. So the boy ends up going back to school and becoming a doctor. And in fact, he becomes one of the most well-known, famous, successful doctors of all time, thanks to his magic healing cloth. Which, to be fair, if you want to train to be a doctor, having a bit of cloth that can cure any wound, I'd say that would get you pretty far. Now, I did actually find reference to an alternative ending to that story that is a little bit less cookie cutter happy ending, in which the boy basically just squanders all of the money that he earns from the silver axe head, so he has to keep using the cloth to generate silver to make more money, which he then just squanders again. At this point, his father becomes really disappointed in him because he realizes that his son is just super lazy and really greedy, and then one day the boy's magic cloth falls into a fire and is destroyed, so the boy loses all his wealth and the source of all his wealth. So, desperate to get it back, he goes back into the woods to try and find the bottle and the demon to try and revoke the deal again. Only this time, the demon tricks the boy into taking his place in the bottle. I'm not sure how I'm feeling about this lip. I might change it. I do only have a few finishing touches left to do, so let me just go do those real quick, and then we can come back and finish up. I literally never wear gold jewelry, so this is a strange sensation for me right now. Also, as I say it, I realised that me being blue is not the weirdest part of this image for me right now. It is just the fact that I'm wearing gold. I don't know what this was about me. Now, genies, as we tend to think of them, started appearing in Western media after Gallen's 1001 Night translation, and they've since become quite a popular trope that over time the depiction of the genie has sort of evolved more into a comedic sense, especially after a couple of different TV series during the 60s. Obviously, one of the most well-known adaptations is the 1992 animated Disney film Aladdin, but there is a huge number of other examples of Western TV and film, as well as musical and like stage productions, obviously all very much focused on the depiction of the genie and how it's sort of evolved. The Jinn, however, have become a really popular and quite common trope in like Middle Eastern horror films, and a study as recently as 2020 revealed that the Jinn are still a favourite horror element amongst teenagers, which does kind of make sense when you think of like the original features of the Jinn, in that they are invisible beings capable of possessing people and causing madness, shape-shifting, living in these like desolate abandoned places. There are some Western depictions that lean more into the like malevolent horror aspect, such as, once again, Supernatural. I think every episode I've done of this series so far has had some link to Supernatural in it. But within Supernatural, the Jinn are depicted as these like humanoid creatures with really elaborately tattooed skin and just these insanely like glowing blue eyes, and they live in caves and old ruins, and they feed on human blood, and they use poison in order to basically make their victims hallucinate and also put them in a sort of comatose state so that they can basically feed on them for longer. The added like contemporary lore within the show was that the Jinn could read people's minds in order to uncover their like deepest desires, and they would then use that information to plant hallucinations in the victim's mind whilst they were in this like coma, to basically lead them to believe that they are living in this desired reality, whereas in fact they are completely paralysed and slowly being killed. It's very Matrixy now that I think of it. The Jinn also feature within the universe of The Witcher, and they're presented as these really powerful like air spirits that, once captured, are bound to their captor and must fulfill 3 wishes before they can be released. The final part of my research that I wanted to touch on was the association with genies and the colour blue. So again, we have to refer back to Disney's Aladdin and the blue genie, because this is generally a lot of the reason why people think of blue genies. And interestingly, in the animated film, the genie was originally meant to be purple, but a decision was made amongst the animators to portray him as blue because it symbolised his like good nature, because blue was often associated with like positive qualities, in stark contrast to the red colour schemes that were usually used for the villain, i.e. Jafar. There was some suggestion that they chose blue as a way of like reflecting the genie's substanceless, basically as a representation of how light scatters through like a gaseous substance. For example, why the sky appears blue. I like the idea of the scientific explanation, but I feel like it is probably more likely to be the stylistic choice to sort of portray his character. Now, I did try and do some research as to whether there was any kind of historical relevance to this, or if it was purely a stylistic choice from Disney that just seemed to have a really long-lasting effect on the general beliefs of these creatures. because even within things like Supernatural, they had the blue eyes and like blue handprints and just a lot of blue. There is one tale within 1001 Nights that has reference to a Jinn appearing from a cloud of blue smoke, but there are also many other references and images that depict the Jinn as like a whole myriad of different colours. There's actually some Islamic traditions where the Jinn are distinguished by their colours. For example, in Syria, the king of the Jinn is often considered to be red, whereas in North Africa, most of the evil Jinn are the ones who are coloured red. And the variation in colour seems to be very much like a regional thing, because in some areas of like Malaysian folklore, it's believed that the Jinn came from 3 mangrove leaves, and the green Jinn came from a leaf that soared into the sky, the black Jinn came from a leaf that fell at the gate of the forest, and the white Jinn came from a leaf that fell into the sea. Little side note on the whole like blue thing though, because I found that apparently blue was very often used within Turkish amulets that offered protection from the Jinn. And with that, we come to the end of the strange evolution of the Jinn from pre-Islamic creatures akin to like gods and deities, all the way through to Disney and eventually Will Smith, but blue. I'm sorry, I know I keep bringing it up, but I can't get over it. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that the Jinn are technically linked to genies, or is it more just kind of an association that came through translations of the word? Because all the information I found about the Jinn and how they were originally perceived, it doesn't tie to the genie thing for me. I don't see that connection. I see Jinn as a separate thing from Islamic culture and Islamic folklore, and then the whole genie thing feels more like the kind of westernized fairy tale that romanticized and kind of over-exaggerated certain Middle Eastern cultures. I don't know, I can't make my mind up on it. The Jinn themselves, though, incredibly fascinating, and like Islamic and Middle Eastern folklore especially is insanely rich. Like, it's so detailed and there's so much that goes into it. It's really, really interesting to look into. I will again apologise for any of the names or places that I got wrong. I really did try with this one. Likewise, if any of the information that I got was off in any way, please let me know. I do try my hardest to make sure I like double check everything, but let me know what you think of the look as well. I'm generally quite happy with it. I know I've just sat here and kind of criticised the Western idea of like the blue genie, and then I've just done it. I wanted to stick to the whole blue thing because it's a very recognizable trait of the genie rather than the Jinn, but I wanted to add elements of it that link back to the Jinn, hence with like the kind of snaky nostrils, because obviously the Jinn preferred the form of a snake. Let me know any other creatures, stories, legends that you want me to cover. Drop a suggestion in the comments down below. Please subscribe if you haven't already. If you have already, I love you. Please leave a like. Thank you. I don't know what I'm saying, it's really late. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video and the look and my jib jabbering. I love and appreciate you all very much. I hope you have a fabulous day, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye bye.